Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. First of all, I'd like to start with an apology, and that's for the state of my lockdown beard. But I think it's important to cultivate some new interests when working from home. Could have learned a foreign language, a musical instrument, read some long Russian novels. I decided to grow this beard. That apology out the way, I'd like to make some thanks. First of all, thank you to our sponsor today, Mission Winnow. I'd like to thank them for supporting the event and making it possible. It's Meet the ChangeShapers, changing the future of mobility. And I'd also like to thank our panelists today, who I will introduce properly in a moment or two. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for giving up part of your day to take part. And I'd like to remind you that you also have some work to do today. We've got a Q&A function, which you should be able to find somewhere on your screen, and I would encourage you to ask questions either as we go along, or we'll have a Q&A session at the end when you can put more questions, and I'll do my best to get an answer for you. Added to that, we have a couple of polls that will come up on your screens as we go along, and we will ask you to vote on them to get your opinion on what's going on. Now, why are we here today? First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Simon Wright. I'm the industry editor at The Economist. My job is to cover a wide range of the more old-fashioned industries, such as manufacturing, shipping, steel, and the like. But monitoring trends in transport, including aviation, car industry, also a big part of my job. And this is where the old meets the new. I believe we're on the cusp of an upheaval in personal mobility, as ownership of vehicles is supplanted by usership, just as we've seen in many other industries. And this travel ecosystem will encompass a range of transport options, both old, including public transport, buses, tubes and trains, and new ones such as ride-hailing, ride-sharing, micro-mobility such as e-scooters and e-bikes, and a host of other means of travel. What's the relevance of this for supply chains, you might ask? This is the expertise of two of our panelists. Well, I think in one way, the future of electric and autonomous vehicles comes as a means of reducing emissions and making transport more sustainable. And sustainability is also a preoccupation in supply chain circles. In a sense, it's one of the many disruptions that we're dealing with, both in transport and in supply chains. And I think one of the themes today we'll look at is disruption. And the application of new technologies will make both personal transport and supply chains more efficient. But I hope the panelists can help me draw more connections between a consumer-facing industry like personal transport and the business-to-business model of global supply chains. Enough of me rattling on. I think it's time for us to get down to business. First of all, I'd like to introduce the panelists today. First of all, we have Mariano Silveyra, Vice President Public Affairs of the Spanish mobility company Cabify. Joining him are Francois Soubien, partner at McKinsey & Company and specialist in supply chains. And also from PMI, who are the direct sponsor of the event, Martijn van der Weijst, director of their supply chain. I'd like to start the conversation today with personal transport. And I'd like to ask Mariano to start off. Mariano, can you tell us what Cabify actually is? How Cabify fits into this new world of personal transport, and how this change to how we're all getting around, especially in cities, is going to impact the future of transport?
Yes, sure, Simon. First of all, hi to everyone. I'm really happy to join with you. And first of all, of course, thank to The Economist for inviting us to share our story and our experience. Well, first of all, Cabify, probably some people in the audience didn't know us, was born in Madrid, in Spain, 8 years ago, with a clear vision of improving the quality of life in cities through technology. We are a technology company, and what we offer is a safe, accessible, quality and sustainable mobility alternative in more than 100 cities from Europe, but basically in Latin America. Of course, we are really proud of that. We are one of the first global ride-hailing platforms to become sustainable, not just because we are carbon neutral since 2018, but also because we achieved a positive EBITDA last quarter of 2019. And what we offer is a complete set of mobility alternatives, all through the same app with the relevant experience. We are offering PHVs, taxis, mopeds, bicycles, e-bikes, electric scooters, and even helicopters in some cities in Latam. And just to highlight, more than half of our rides came from taxis. And in fact, we are proud that we are one of the biggest taxi platforms in the world. The idea is just to build a simple, intuitive, and frictionless experience where our riders can move from A to B, choosing the best alternative, and that's our main goal, and why more than 1,000 people in Cabify are working every day to innovate and to disrupt with ideas and with solutions to tackle that.
Can you just outline us very quickly how you use technology to integrate these different forms of transport and how that improves the experience of traveling around cities?
One of the main challenges here is, of course, to integrate many different alternatives that, of course, you can understand that behaves in a completely different way. We're talking about taxis, we are talking about mopeds, we are talking about bikes, but the idea is to integrate all of them in a only seamless experience through our app, just to simplify as much as we can through technology, the way our users interact, the way our users think on Cabify when they have a need to move around the city. And the idea is to build a real seamless and intuitive and frictionless experience through this app. And of course, to balance, that is one of the main challenges from every ride-hailing platform in all over the world, is to completely balance our capacity and our demand, and that is probably some of the main challenges in the mobility, in the urban mobility in every city. So we are working very hard to solve that. We believe that there's a huge gap between what we are doing right now and the things, or the way we want to move people in the near future. Technology, of course, is going to be a key tool to solve that.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, you talk about sort of seamlessness, and Francois, if I can come to you, supply chains are also supposed to function seamlessly, but particularly over the last year, because of the pandemic, but also in previous years, the supply chains are being disrupted, very much as personal transport is being disrupted. Perhaps you could talk me through some aspects of this disruption and how you think transport could play into making that, smoothing out some of the bumps in supply chains.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Simon, and hello to everybody. I hope you're safe. So yeah, just a few data points. I think when we pick up some June 2020 data compared to previous year, few observation on disruption impact. One is, for example, the air transport revenue going down by 87%. It's also, to your point on car ride, Uber car ride going down by 70%, or it's in the subway traffic in New York, a reduction of 78%. So just to come to your point, so COVID-19 indeed catapulted supply chain resilience on the top of the media agenda. And we could already see when we began our research that supply chain shock were becoming more severe and predominantly due to change in the environment and the economy. Just an important output of the research that we did is that companies can expect to lose 40% of 1 year EBITDA, 40% in a decade. And this is due to supply chain shock. And a single shock, a severe one, can cause a 100-day disruption. So you can imagine that this could wipe out an entire year earning in some industries. So in our research, we also wanted to add facts to a complex discussion on how disruption, on how much disruption and shop cost, which help, in fact, the conversation on how much CEO should spend on resilience to prevent this shock from happening or to make them more bearable. We also quantify how much production could actually shift. And sometimes it has been done to date and has been the source of deep speculation. So finally, just to conclude on this, I think company can mitigate against this risk, and doing so, it will pay off. And these risks are not only a pandemic. It can be cyber attack, it can be a major supplier bankruptcy, and then a company with a resilient supply chain can reduce the EBITDA impact of a disruption, and we evaluated by 23 percentage points. And an average large company, in fact, can invest up to 40% of 1 year EBITDA in resilience measure and still have a positive return on investment when you look at it over a decade.
Thank you, Francois. Martin, can I bring you in here? Francois brought up the subject of resilience in supply chains, and I think resilience in supply chains, resilience in transport systems in general is a vital factor, particularly in the future as we things become more autonomized. What I'd really like to understand from you is what your company has done to ensure resilience in your supply chain. I'd like you to look at that overall, but also if you could sort of talk about the sort of transport elements of the supply chain, just getting things from A to B in particular, that'd be interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon, and my previous speakers. I hope you can hear me clearly. Absolutely, in supply chain, and for years already, resilience has always been part of the agenda. And I think the 9 months, indeed, as Francois said, made it a top priority. But I would bring it a step further, right? Resilience in terms of how are you prepared? Now, I think we have all seen that actually nobody was prepared for this kind of a pandemic, right? Because the impact vis-a-vis the likelihood was always considered low. But it's much more the last couple of months, what I see now is the agility. How do you respond and how do you deploy innovation, also in the area of transportation, to actually respond to any form of disruption to secure basically the customer service delivery. Keeping that in mind, I think the last 9 months have actually, let's say, catapulted as well certain new technologies in terms of especially visibility on potential disruptions to reorchestrate and recalibrate your supply chain. That's what I've seen happening, and that's actually came a complete new insight in terms of how do we can actually further optimize our supply chains moving forward. Potentially also, and that's more related to your question, Simon, to what is actually the future objective of supply chain, right? And I think so far it was always about, minimizing inventories, minimizing costs, etc. And it might actually be keeping the service in mind for our end customer, that maybe we need to factor in certain other factors, that sometimes having a little bit of redundancy in your chain is actually good to have to respond and to be agile to these kind of events.
Great, thank you. I understand entirely. Perhaps you could tell me some of the sort of technological innovations that you've brought into your supply chain management that have helped to promote that then.
Now, here in Philip Morris, we are globalizing our supply chain in line with our new product categories, which is an ecosystem of a consumable and an electronics device, which makes the supply chain rather unique, I believe, in the world, but also very complex. And in view of that, we have always been seeing technology as a foundation of the future supply chain. And I think the last 9 months have actually called for this extremely high degree of visibility. And some of the technology that we piloted last year, luckily we had put in place, and I can tell you that actually helped us to become managing, or actually be able to manage the situation very strongly. I'm talking about technology of real-time visibility on transportation, right? We could really see in the control tower that we have here what the queues on certain border crossings were. We could predict the delays in some of the ocean carriers having, let's say, congestions at some of the ports. We could see and anticipate that situation before actually being confronted with the news that your shipment was arriving late. So the degree of visibility that actually we see in some of, let's say, the Wright hauling apps, like was mentioned before, actually is now deployed to a larger scale industry as well, both for overland and on ocean transportation.
So in a sense, it's about managing the data that's now being thrown off in enormous quantities by all the sort of links in the supply chain. Mariano, perhaps I could come back to you. Managing this data is also an important part of what you do, presumably. Can you talk me through some of the innovations you've used to manage this data, and then go on to explain how the pandemic has affected your business and how that innovation has helped or even hindered people moving around during the pandemic? So there's two parts to that question.
Yes, sure, Simon. First of all, I completely agree with what Martin said recently. Of course, in the end, what we need to do is to close the gap between both two worlds, the supply and the demand side, and that is affecting, of course, and the transportation in every way, logistics and also urban mobility. Any example can be explained of this challenge to close that gap, because if you're not closing that gap, you're losing a lot of money, or you're providing quality services to the user, anyone the user could be. On our side, of course, as a technology company, we manage thousands of different data in most of all in time. We have a huge team of specialists, many of them data scientists, that are completely analyzing and testing and trying to understand user behaviors. When we are talking about users, we are talking about not only the rider that decides to move around the city, but also the ones who provides that services. We're talking about the drivers. We have more than 500,000 drivers all over the world that are working with our platform. And you need to understand, you need to use all the data that you have to understand the journey that each of both audiences experiments when they decide to use you, or when a driver decides to accept a journey that you are offering. There are many things that can fail. There are many things that make a difference once you understand that, and the only way you can manage that kind of complexity. Imagine the amount of variables that affects the curve in 100 cities. I don't know, any city you choose, the weather, the traffic, the other competitors, the public transport. There are 100 variables that behaves, and the only way to understand that is using technology, measuring many key levers that affects your supply or your demand capacity, and of course the technology can also help you to simplify those hundreds or thousands of mini challenges that you have in each of your journeys that you are trying to understand, and the only thing to solve that is to simplify that kind of solutions and to tackle that as an opportunity and to understand that and try to iterate and try to execute really fast. And at the end, technology is going to help you executing really fast. It's just a question of speed. How fast can you understand the market? How fast can you understand your audiences? And how fast can you execute your solutions to the market?
Thank you very much. I'd like to come on. Sorry, yes,
related with the COVID, just to answer your question.
Before we do that, can I
really affects. Yeah, sorry, Simon.
Before we do that, I'd really like to do that, but we have a couple of audience polls, and they take a little time for the results to come through. I wonder if you could run the first one while you're answering the second part of that question. and so we can get an answer from our audience on the first question. That would be really helpful. I wonder if we could get that run now. Do carry on with the rest of the answer about the pandemic.
Just to complete, what happens with the COVID? Is as simple as the COVID is a huge change that completely erase all the things that we understand about consumers, about the way they move in a city. And now basically all the industries, we are talking about public or private industries related to mobility, try to begin from zero. And the only way you can understand the new behaviors of the users, considering that there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of questions that the user really need to answer to make a secure decision. The only way to tackle that is with technology. So it's a question on how fast you can understand that and how fast you can tackle and solve that problem.
Simon, if you allow me to comment on what Silveyra said, I would like to add one more thing, right? And I fully agree. The technology gives you the insight, right? Collecting the data and the technology, using technology to give you that insight. But I would like to bring it a step forward. I do believe that the winning game for the future in these kind of complex supply chain is not just the insight, is what you do with that insight to actually become more predictive, right? Basically make sure the supply is there before the ask. Right, so these kind of insight, and we know there's technologies out there, and they're getting pretty predictable now that they actually are capable of translating very fast, right, in almost real-time situation, let's say data into predictive that could actually be a competitive edge for any form of supply chain, if you like, in the ride sharing or even for a company like Philip Morris.
I absolutely agree.
It's a question of execution. It's execution. That's right. Yeah.
And I think this is also changing, I think, the role of supply chain in terms of bringing goods physically from A to B. I think the future of supply chain is much more in terms of providing the insight to the rest of the partners in your company, your commercial partners, for example, to ensure that they don't have to worry about the physical element, but make sure that the supply is agile enough to respond to any, let's say, change on the consumer demand.
Just to be sorry, Simon. I don't want to hijack session, but I just wanted to build on what Mariano and Martijn said. I think what we see is three area for improvement out of the COVID-19. One is really leveraging the power of digital. Then we can better connect the value chain itself, and indeed apply some advanced analytics to better predict or to anticipate. The second measure are really around the putting in place some measure to mitigate some of the risks, like diversify the supply chain network, stabilize some of the transportation flows, etc. And the last one is around flexibility. We can get more flexibility from a financial and operational standpoint, like, for example, putting more inventory, flexing production with some of the supplier. So I just wanted to build on what others had just said.
Right. Well, while we've been doing that, we've run the first poll, which the question was, how important is sustainability to you when choosing your own personal mode of transport? And the answer, we've come out very important, fairly important, have come out as sort of 66% winners, and not important at all is right down the bottom. Sustainability is very important for the future of both personal transport and supply chains. Perhaps, Martijn, we could go to you. What do you do? What do you think is important when you're thinking about the sustainability and the emissions from your own supply chain?
No, I think it's a fundamental importance, this part, not only because we asked to, not only that we also as Philip Morris acknowledge the problem that we have in the world, But I think even more importantly is that basically the consumer is asking for it, right? So for me, I see a great future to engineer supply chains with minimal carbon emissions or even zero fossil fuel usage. And I think this is something we are just at the beginning part of this stream, not just for the passenger in the individual transportation, but also more for, let's say, the cargoes in big bulk that is requested from us to contribute to this global problem.
And Francois, could I come to you? And it's the same sort of question. What do you think that we can do in supply chains in the future to ensure continued sustainability? Because this is a question that sort of predates the pandemic, but it's also a question that has
I think on this topic, clearly the world needs reinvention. What we see post-COVID-19 is that all the government support are triggered toward better sustainability. If you look, for example, at the support into electric vehicle that some of the government are putting in place to encourage the switch to more sustainable vehicles. This is one example. A similar example into the commercial aviation, where government are encouraging aircraft manufacturer to switch to alternative propulsion mode, like hydrogen, hybrid or electrical. And if third you take a company standpoint, I think there's great improvement to be made to reinvent not only the physical system that produce CO2 emission and also has impact into the ecosystem, but also take better anticipation to release waste into the system. And this link back to our previous conversation on end-to-end transparency, advanced analytics, and predictive.
That's great. Mariano, can I ask you a similar sort of question? How important to your customers do you think it is that the modes of transport they use are sustainable?
Yeah, well, we believe that is the one thing. We believe that, well, we have an example, after due COVID, we saw all our cities completely naked of cars and really breathing and becoming a healthy place to live. And that's one explanation, of course, as soon as we can to change our mobility patterns in the city. And the users, of course, are the first affected. And also are the first people that are responsible on that. But the city governments really need to improve the amount of alternatives, not only but also private alternatives for people to really decide, to really have alternatives to left their own car at home, or even not to use or buy a private car. And to move through many of the alternatives that we have. First of all, because the efficiency, once you balance your supply and the demand curve of mobility, is really huge. That is really good. Using many vehicles to move more people. That's the first step, and we are tackling that. The other one is going to be, of course, once that those vehicles, those alternatives will be electrified. As I mentioned, Cabify are the first company 100% carbon neutral since 2020. We already compensate more than 250,000 of CO2. It's not enough, and that becomes complexity to do that, but we are really compromised to electrify all of our fleet in the upcoming years, Imagine that if you can imagine to change all the cars in the city and electric cars, that's not solving any problem. That is solving just one problem about pollution. But of course, there's many problems that still has to be solved. So in our view, customers or our consumers are really concerned more and more each day to use sustainable alternatives. Mobility is here to stay, and we are trying to improve all the experience. We already a couple of weeks ago launched a new brand, a new category called Vibe. What we are trying to do on that is try to solve all the complexity, all the uncertainty, all the frictions that moving with a bike in the city people has. That it's not so easy to become the Amsterdam. Amsterdam took many years to do that, and you need to solve the problems to the people to convince them to use their bikes. There's many questions to be solved first, and that is also sustainability. Sustainability is not only electric cars, electric vehicles. There's a lot of things around that: ethics, transparency, governance, inclusion, accessibility. There's millions of people has very limited access to alternatives, like blinded people or deaf people, or all many things to be solved, and sustainable is a key question to tackle all that.
In a sense, sustainability and efficiency go hand in hand. And looking to the sort of far future, and this is a question for everyone, there are sort of developments in transport that could improve this. There are the technological developments that we've talked about, but there are other things as well. There's electrification, which we've also touched upon. The other thing is autonomy, both in terms of autonomous driving and the robotization of elements of the supply chain. I'd like to ask each of you in turn to look far into the future and think what technology is going to have the most impact further down the line. Francois, could we come to you first? Could you give us a sense of what you think is going to be the next big development in the technologies that are going to be important for supply chains?
Okay, I think there's few depending on the time frame at which you look at.
Oh, let's think big and wide.
So indeed, with many of our clients that we see a shared rise of automation and a growing interest into automated truck, even automated autonomous aircraft. And what I see from our different clients is that there's clear program invest into this technology, once all legal and technology aspects are in place. So this is clearly one. And it applies for all type of vehicle. It applies for car, for aircraft, for ships. The second piece, which is more short-term and accessible to organization, is definitively about artificial intelligence, advanced analytics, moving to predictive. And we see some example of client putting already this system in place, where, for example, you can anticipate what will be the shipment going to an area, and this anticipation, this helps you to massify what we call, sorry for the term, but to massify some of the shipment, and indeed having a better impact onto the planet, or a bad impact on the planet. So this is the two immediate trends that I foresee.
Martin, can I come to you now? It's the same question. How far will the introduction of autonomy, both, we've talked about autonomous cars a little bit, and autonomous cars have been a little bit overhyped, but autonomy is coming to a variety of other modes of transport, as Francois pointed out, to ships, planes, possibly trucks. How important do you think that's going to be in supply chains? And how important do you think managing all this with a robust technology platform is going to be in the future?
Yep. No, I cannot agree more. And to be honest, I think we are just at the beginning of a revolution in supply chain on autonomy. I think it's the next big thing, the self-driving car. The next thing is the self-driving supply chain, in my view. And I think with all the technology, using this data, there's a lot of opportunities in supply chain indeed to completely automate certain steps. Right, because it's supply chain is all about, you know, taking data, convert it, and putting as an input in your next process. It's a chain of different steps, and many of those steps. And here we actually are already exploring certain technologies, especially on the cognitive demand forecasting, where we actually have proven now that for a large parts of the cases, the majority of the cases, this technology is actually doing an equal, but in many cases, even a better job in forecasting demand. So basically, that's also the message that we are running now with this new technology, the new products that we're launching. This requires a completely different skill set of analyzing data and rapidly translating into plans. And there's no human being that is able to do it at that speed. You need to rely on these technologies to basically be more predictive in your demand. Now, I liked also the link what Francois made, because in the end of the day, we know it's not getting easier on the front end, at the consumer end, right? The expectations in terms of speed, delighting the customer expectation, the topic on sustainability. So that will continue to complexify. What you could do is to basically enhance the predictability of it and therefore massify your upstream part in terms of optimizing through autonomy, let's say through better predictability, your upstream supply chain within your own territory, but I think also towards your tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. That brings actually a topic that I also would like to bring forward is really the value stream collaboration with your partners, right? Moving away from the traditional, let's say, supplier relationship management. You cannot optimize your supply chain anymore by looking at your own kitchen, right? You can only do as good as you are yourself, but you can see that the reliance on upstream partners become tremendous important, especially when you talk about innovative products and rapidly changing demand.
I mean, managing the supply chain, and perhaps Francois can come back on this after Martin, is a fantastically complex matter, particularly when we get further down the supply chain. I look at the car industry in particular, and a big company can manage their tier 1 suppliers fairly easily. The tier 1 suppliers can manage the tier 2, but the big companies have absolutely no idea what's going on at tier 4 and tier 5, and that's where the disaster can happen. The Japanese tsunami was a great example of it knocking out a plant that produced an awful lot of the car paint that no one had ever even heard of, and it incredibly disrupted supply chains. How do you go about managing that far down the supply chain, and what can these future technologies help with?
I think. No, go ahead, Martin.
No, I think for us, it was a game changer. For us, being traditional tobacco company, where we're managing our supply chain very well with the farmers, with their own factories, now we brought in this component of electronics. And we all know that the electronics has a much longer lead time, and some of the components are taking 8 to 9 months before actually it lands in your assembly factory. So for us, there was a clear need to have almost a real-time visibility to your tier 2 and tier 1 suppliers, because without them, without giving them the early insights on what the future demand is, you will be selling out of stock all over the world. So for me, that was a game changer, and it was also the driver behind the transformation that we're driving here in our company, to say we need to revisit the way we work with our suppliers and our partners to get the visibility and use the data to provide the right insight.
Francois, do you agree with that? Is it the data you can use to get this visibility, or are there other things involved?
I think what I see across different industries with our client is that more put focus on value stream optimization, meaning having an holistic understanding of what's going on from an OEM to a tier 5 supplier. And it's a super complex topic, because to do so, you need to bring transparency along this value chain, and bringing transparency means at the end. So you need to focus on what are the critical data that should be shared in a specific value stream. You need also to define some norm on how to do it and some ways of working that is common to this value stream. And you have some example, for example, in the aircraft manufacturing industry, same in the automotive industry, same in the consumer and retail industry. And this could be reinvented with a layer bringing transparency, but also supplemented with some advanced analytics triggered toward resiliency, efficiency, and sustainability.
That's right. Mariano, we got a little bit sidetracked on supply chains there, but I want to come back to the issue of autonomy and autonomous cars. Can we also run the second poll, please? Because I think this is relevant here. It's about overhyped new technologies. Autonomous cars, much of the hype seems to have gone out of that area of the car industry recently. It's going to be a while till we get true autonomy. Can you give us, one, your idea of what you think the timeline will be, and two, how you think that will alter how your business operates?
Yes, sure. Well, the autonomous vehicles, in my opinion, is really, really far away. Not because of the technology, because the technology is there. There are many car manufacturers and also technology companies like Google, for example, that are improving really, really the technology, but it will be tested with millions of miles. So it's going to take a lot of years, at least, to start seeing vehicles every day. But where are going to be seeing those vehicles? In my opinion, the last field that we're going to be seeing that is in urban cities. It makes a lot of sense to start in the highways, to start the railways, to start in where the risks are really, really low. But the complexity of a city, you can understand that it's not the same thing to move around Berlin than to move around Mexico City. You imagine how the technology can solve the complexity of an African or Asian or Latin American city. There are a lot of things to move forward. So we are not seeing in at least 10, 15 years. If technology is close to being the level 3 or more, or level 4 or level 5 of autonomous vehicles. So in my opinion, the most important technology disruption here that is really going to solve part of the problems of the mobility in the cities is the multimodality. In fact, considering an engineering perspective, today we have millions of people moving every day. We have many different alternatives on the supply side, but are completely disconnected. So the challenge here is how we can balance together both worlds. How we can, and the problem is that we are working very hard on the front end side. The technology companies are solving many problems on the experience in front of the consumer, but on the back end, there's still a huge challenge. For example, we need to start working in the integration of the trains, the buses. There's a many complexity in each city because it's a local problem that need to be solved. And the is to at least if I want to go from A to B in city, the idea is to have many alternatives, the most sustainable, the most expensive, the most the fastest, a combination, and a lot of complexity trying to solve all the frictionless between all the alternatives. Today, there's no communication between them. First of all, because the most efficient ones on the public side and the most discretionary ones are on the private side. So we need to start getting solutions combined. And then, of course, in the next, for example, 5 years, electrification. But most of all, multimodality is going to make a huge impact. Not also moving parts, because we are also moving objects. We are also working on the supply side, at least in the last mile. We have many cars moving around the city, and there are part of the time that has a lot of capacity, and that's when we talk about efficiency. So the idea is to really combine in a more efficient way the supply side to provide a more simple way to move in the city.
I think you're right. It's all about sort of harnessing what we have now, and I think our audience agrees in with that, because the poll about whether transport technologies such as Hyperloop, and I think vertical flight means flying taxis, whether that's overhyped and underhyped, we've got 78.9% saying overhyped. And I think in terms of Hyperloop, that's right. I'm not so sure about flying cars and taxis, though. I think that's a technology that I think we will see in some sort of niche applications much sooner than our other audience thinks.
It's amazing to do that, but just try to think about payment interaction. Today, it's a huge complexity when you have to think about payment in every alternative mobility. Just to solve that is a huge challenge.
Yeah. Just before we go to the Q&A session, which is going to be next, I'd just like to ask Francois and Martijn, you're both clearly businessmen who travel around a lot. Would both of you be happy to take a flying taxi to the airport? Francois, what do you think?
Indeed. No, indeed. I mean, I will follow. I will follow technology. I mean, if this happens, I will do it. Yeah, for sure. I'm super happy with that.
I agree with Francois. I lived for many years in Asia, out of which quite some years in Jakarta. I know what traffic can be, and if you're about to miss your flight, you do everything possible to catch it. So jumping on motor rides or even flying taxis, I would definitely do it.
That's great stuff. Now, look, what we're going to do now is throw the floor open to the audience who can put some questions to the panelists from things that have been arising today. I mean, I think to sort of start off, we have a question that would go to Mariano, and it's a very interesting question, a question I'd be interested to hear the answer to. One of the jobs that you have to do is you have to integrate private and semi-private forms of transport with public transport for an integrated multimodal, to use a sort of jargon term, transport system to work. How do you go about doing that, making it seamless between city transport authorities, what you do, what the other modes of transport, how they operate? How do you bring all that together? How do you persuade people to be involved, perhaps?
It's a challenge. The question is really relevant. So today we are every platform is working most of all in the information side. I don't know. So we believe that the first step is to become relevant for our users, not providing only services, but also providing relevant information. And the first challenge today is to gather all the information related with the public transportation that is not there. It's not easy to gather that. I think that the first challenge is that the governments really have an open platform where all that information with open APIs could be used by us or by anyone, and of course to integrate that information in our experience. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that you have to have the alternative to the same from A to B, and public transportation is key on that decision. But first of all, you need to provide useful and relevant information, and then of course payment side is going to be a huge challenge, just because the public transportation is not integrated itself. There are governments that are starting to make some steps on that, but imagine we have more than 100 cities, and unfortunately we're going to have to discuss in each of the 100 cities a particular solution. So technology is going to handle that. We need to be very, very flexible on that, on our guys, on our back, to try to provide seamless experience. So it's going to be a real huge challenge for us and for everyone.
In a sense, that's a sort of a regulatory challenge as much as anything else.
Yeah. And the problem is that the government, of course, is not aligned. Each government, and most of all, each local government is doing their own business, their own solution, and the mobility is not only local. You can understand as a local problem, but you have to think in a more transversal way just to solve things like that, because we saw it with the micromobility. There's many companies that go bankruptcy because there's a local company. When you think of local mobility solutions, there's no profitable. It's a real shame. So we need to move forward in a more integration and a more massive solutions to become profitable. And that it's a question of sustainability too. The business models in mobility is also a concern. You have to be sustainable on time too, not only in an environmental perspective.
I have another question coming up here. This one's from Martin, but I think Francois, you might have a view on it as well. It's given a choice between selecting a sustainable shipping company, which might be more expensive, and a non-sustainable way of moving things through a supply chain. Which one would you choose? I think the question here is actually, how do you absorb the costs of a more sustainable supply chain, which presumably will be a more expensive option?
Yeah, I think the natural reaction would be, of course, as cost is important, you have difficulty to justify. But we see actually the opposite as well. I believe that there is also a demand for having sustainable, segmented route to consumer. And I think that's where we are at the beginning of this journey, that will be forced, and we are doing our utmost already, to be able to minimize the footprint and even put a route to consumer in place that actually gives you the opportunity as a consumer to say, my product was delivered in a carbon-free neutral way. I think we're just at the beginning. We saw it with the grocery stores already coming up, and I think we are just at the beginning what's going to happen in the FMCG industry.
Francois, you go on.
Yeah, so I'm fully with Martin on this. I think there's one of the factors that Simon need to be considered is that out of the research that we did, we estimated that between 3 to 4.5 trillion of annual trade will shift, which is, in fact, just to give an essence, is between 16 to 6% of the global export that you have today. So the picture in 5 years may be different. So this is one. And what we see, and this is why you start with some of this term, is some reversion to more local or domestic production, nearshoring, or shift to different offshore location. And this need to be considered because coupled with some accelerated trend like digital e-commerce, I think more and more supply chain will have to be more regional and local to address the sustainability aspect. The consumer preference, indeed, and the way they bring value to the proposition will be, in fact, crucial. And that was the point of Martin.
Okay, we're going to have to very soon wrap up. We're running out of time, but there's one last, and it's a big question, but let's give it a go. It's a big, broad question, very difficult to answer, and you're going to have about 30 seconds each. Does the pandemic put the benefits of globalization into question? Perhaps that's one for you to start with.
Well, I believe I can say this one. So look, I will take a different path to answer this one. In fact, since reaching a nadir in 2012, in fact, the share of the trade that was occurring in the same region has begun to rebound. If I take some example, in 2009, the intra-regional trade was already accounted for 60% of all trade in Asia Pacific, and 64% in Europe. And it may be possible depending on the industry and the goods that you trade, like, for example, traded goods, automotive, chemical, food and beverage, that this product will be more and more imported from regional partners. In contrast, there's also some other industry like medical device, aerospace, pharmaceutical, that are more like through long-haul trade. So it's not a black and white answer. It's more sector per sector, and even sometimes company by company answer to this question on the future of globalization.
Great. We've got 3 minutes left, so I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there. It's been a very, very interesting discussion. I think we've learned that both the future of personal transport and the future of supply chains is going to be a complex one, and it's one that's going to be driven by big data, by the issues of sustainability, and also by the issues of the changing transport infrastructure in some ways. So what it remains for me to do is to thank you, the audience, for taking part today and for your very interesting questions, to thank my panelists, Francois, Soubien, Mariano and Martijn, and also to thank you, the audience, again for taking part today. And I'd like to say goodbye and thank you. And thank you to the sponsor again.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting us.
Thank you
Very much.
Bye. It's a pleasure.